And we are live. All right. So right before the break, we were talking about some of the topics we're going to discuss today. And I talked about the Trail of Tears. This really ties into history. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow the people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you've been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. And history tells you history tells you what happened and how you got to this point where you are today. And it gives you some idea of what you need to do to get to where you want to go. But you have to understand the history, the laws and policies that were put in place that got you to the point where you are today. Okay, so if we look at this dealing with the Trail of Tears, okay, and this ties into the Indian Removal Act of 1830, as well as the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians, okay. I want to look at, there was an article here from CNN.com, and I'm going to pull this back up. Okay, there's an article from CNN.com. Native Americans weren't alone on the Trail of Tears. Native Americans weren't alone on the Trail of Tears. Enslaved Africans were too. Now, this article is from May 9th, 2021. We're going to pull it up here on the screen share. And May 30th, now you're going to see some commemorations of the signing of the Trail of Tears. I was reading about that today among the Choctaw Native Americans, because May 28th is the anniversary of the signing of the Indian Removal Act, which was signed May 28th, 1830. Okay, so this article is from Nicole Chavez for CNN.com. Now, and actually in the article, they show the intersection of Greenwood Avenue and Archer in 1917. So this is a few years before the attack in 1921. It says many of the in this image were later destroyed in the 1921 massacre. So they're showing this in Oklahoma. Okay, this was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we know Tulsa was founded by Creek Indians around 1836. Okay, who got pushed off that land because of the Indian Removal Act. Tulsa, Oklahoma was founded by Creek Indians around 1836. And the word Tulsa comes from the Creek Indian word Talasi. The word Tulsa comes from the Creek Indian word Talasi. Okay, so you can't get away from this history when you study the language, when you study the history. This ties into African people. This ties into Native Americans. All right. Let me flip over here. I'm trying to pull up this article. Just 1 second here. Okay. So it talks about an author named Elena E. Roberts. Elena Roberts is African American. And it says, hold on a second, let me flip back over to it. So it says, when Elena Roberts started piecing her family's history together, she made a surprising discovery that changed what it meant to be a Black American or what it meant to be African American. Her father's ancestors in Oklahoma were once enslaved by Native Americans. Now, more people are finding about this history today, and we know it was heavily among the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians. Now, nearly a century before Tulsa's Greenwood district became a beacon of Black prosperity in the 1920s, Native American tribes or Native American nations and thousands of enslaved African people arrived in the state of Oklahoma. Now, Now Oklahoma becomes a state in the Union in 1907. Before that, it's a territory in the Union. Okay. And this also ties into the history of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, because the U.S. is going to get about 828,000 square miles of land in the Louisiana Purchase from France. The French, Napoleon Bonaparte, they get the behinds kicked by the Haitians during the Haitian Revolution, and the France is trying to raise money, so they sell the land here that they stole from Native Americans, and they sell that to another thief called the United States of America. So the U.S. is going to carve out about 15 states, 15 territories, 15 states out of the land that they get from Louisiana, from the Louisiana Purchase. And the land that they get from the Louisiana Purchase is going to double the size of the United States, and is going to increase the need now for more enslaved Africans to work the land in the territories where they're going to have slavery. They try to keep a balance between free states and enslaved states, but it's going to increase the need in some of these territories for enslaved Africans. This is the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which came about because of the Haitian Revolution. And Oklahoma is going to be one of those territories that the U.S. gets in the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, so this is why you have to understand the chronology of history. All this history is connected. Okay. And I hated history when I was in school, by the way, because they taught white history largely. I hated history when I was in school. It wasn't until I got to college that I really started having an interest in history outside of the classroom. Now, members of the 5 tribes, or what are also known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans, because they took on the ways of white people. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The Chickasaw, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole Native American nations. Members of these 5 tribes have been forced out of their homelands in the deep South. Okay, Georgia and Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida, leading to the exodus known as the Trail of Tears. Now, Elena E. Roberts says owning slaves, or owning African slaves, was a part of their strategy to assimilate into American society, and it allowed them to be seen as different from other Native American people and as more civilized. Okay, now Elena Roberts is an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, Elena Roberts, and here's a picture of her. Maybe I'll interview her on the show. Elena Roberts tells the story of how Oklahoma became a melting pot and the decades of racial tensions that preceded the Tulsa Race Massacre in her new book entitled I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. I've been here all the while, Black freedom on Native land. Now, speaking of being here all the while, those that are enrolled in my online course, we talk about this. You've also heard the interviews I've done with Dr. David Imhotep, author of the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. Okay. African people are the original Native Americans. Now, what I mean by this is I'm not saying the transatlantic slave trade did not happen. That happens thousands of years later. I'm saying when you read his book and you look at the evidence, the Khoisan, who have the oldest DNA on the planet and go all around the world, the Khoisan, who were the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa, the Khoisan were here in this land, going back at least 51,700 years ago in the territory today known as South Carolina. And this is before the people who we call Native Americans come into existence. And, you know, we're making voyages from Africa to from here back and forth. So this was our land stolen from us a number of times. So we have to understand this. Yes, the transatlantic slave trade happened. You want to understand the chronology of thousands of years of history leading up to the transatlantic slave trade starting in 1441 with the Portuguese going into Mauritania. But just because African people had been here for tens of thousands of years, That does not mean that hundreds of thousands were still not brought to this land. You can go back to 1526 with the Spanish taking Africans into the territory called South Carolina. This is before the British colonies were set up, starting in 1607 in Virginia. Okay, so we have to understand this chronology of history. All right, how's everybody doing? 313-778-7600 is the calling number if you have a question or comment. 313-778-7600 is the calling number if you have a quick question or comment. And then also, if you want to support the African History Network, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, $, the AHN Show through Cash App, also through PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN Show. All right, let's continue here. So, Elena E. Roberts, Associate Professor of History at the University of Pittsburgh, is the author of the book, I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land. And she tells the story of how Oklahoma became a melting pot and the decades of racial tensions that preceded the Tulsa Race Massacre that began January 1st, 1921. And you have the events May 30th and May 31st of 1921 that precipitated the race massacre. Now, for Elena E. Roberts, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre is only a portion of the complicated history of African American, Native American, and white people, European Americans in Oklahoma. After the Civil War is 1861 to 1865, these five Native American nations signed a treaty with the United States government abolishing slavery, because many of these Native American nations wanted to hold on to their African slaves after the Civil War ended. Okay. And they said basically they didn't have to give up their slaves because they were sovereign nations. All right. So yeah, the Civil War ended, but we still want to keep our slaves. Now, the other thing that's important to understand is that all five nations of what are known as the five civilized tribes of Native Americans, all five of them fought on behalf of the South during the Civil War, okay, because they wanted to maintain slavery. Okay, so all five of them fought on behalf of the South during the Civil War as well. Okay, now they're going to sign the Indian treaties of 1866 with the U.S. government, and they're going to get, territory. And what happens is they're going to be put on Indian reservations. Okay, they're going to be put on Indian reservations. The reason why is because prior to the Civil War, they were on Indian territories. They had Indian territories, and what's going to happen is because they when they signed these treaties for these Indian territories prior to the Civil War, there were clauses in those treaties that stated that they could never take up arms against the Union. Well, these treaties most likely were in English, and a lot of them didn't speak English. So when they fought on behalf of the South in the Civil War, and we know the South seceded from the Union, starting with South Carolina, December 20th, 1860, they committed treason against the Union. This violated their treaty. So the Indian territories are going to be taken back. They're going to be put on Indian reservations. All right. So all this history is connected. Now, after the Civil War, the five tribes signed a treaty with the U.S. government abolishing slavery. Those formerly enslaved by the tribes known as freedmen, black freedmen. So you hear them referred to as freedmen or freed people. They built churches and schools. Now, it's interesting that after slavery, they were called freedmen or freed people. Notice how many of us say we're descendants of slaves, not descendants of former slaves or descendants of freed people, descendants of black freedmen. descendants of black freed people. Because after, like when you look at the Freedmen's Bank was a bank created by the federal government for formerly enslaved Africans. It wasn't called the former slave bank. It's called the Freedmen's Bank. You're going to see after slavery, they refer to as freedmen. So you have to ask the question, right? Why do we put our ancestors back into a state that they were freed from? Why do we put our ancestors back into a state of slavery that they were freed from? When you go study during Reconstruction, they're referred to as freedmen. So why do we keep putting them back into a state that they were freed from? Maybe it's because we think like slaves. Just a thought. So study Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. So those formerly enslaved by the tribes, known as freedmen or freed people, built churches and schools. They also acquired land, built businesses, built communities. They later received allotments of land as part of the 1887 Dawes Allotment Act, which redistributed about 138 million acres of land, the Dawes Allotment Act, named after Senator Henry L. Dawes, 1887. Now, that was supposed to be a reallocation of land going to Native Americans and Black Indians, things like this. But white people got 2/3 of the land. There is at Britannica.com, they have an entry for the Dawes Allotment Act. Dawes General Allotment Act of 1887 at Britannica.com. So you can read that. We'll pull this up here quickly. Dawes General Allotment Act, 1887. February 8th, 1887, U.S. law providing for the distribution of Indian reservation land among individual Native Americans with the aim of creating responsible farmers in the white man's image. It was sponsored in several sessions of Congress by Senator Henry L. Dawes of Massachusetts. It was finally enacted in February 1887. Okay. And let's see, the original supporters of the act were genuinely interested in the welfare of Native Americans, but there were not enough votes in Congress to pass it until it was amended. Okay. Scroll down. There's more. Okay. The fifth, 138 million acres of land. And white people ended up getting 2/3 of this land also. This is where you get the concept of a $5 Indian from. And this was like a census, kind of like a census that had to be taken. And to get your name added to this Dawes roll to be allocated land, you had to anglicize your name. Take on an English name, anglicize your name. So when white people found out about this, they started paying $5 to have their names added to the roll so they can get this land. Okay. Kind of like how white people found out about the $5 billion in loan forgiveness and aid in the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan for African American farmers and Native American farmers and Hispanic farmers and Asian American farmers. And then they started suing the government saying we're being discriminated against. But you didn't say anything when you got $26 billion in 2020 from the Trump administration, and African American farmers got 20.8 million, 0.1% out of $26 billion. You were silent. Kind of like that. You know, we've talked about that here on the show. Okay. There was an interview with the Washington Post that U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack did March 25th. Okay. March 25th. And Tom Vilsack laid out this history. And you have people like Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, running around calling this racism. But Senator Lindsey Graham ignores the previous 100 years of racism against African-American farmers that caused them to lose 92% of their land, almost 12 million acres of land. Okay. Kind of like that. Of those who identify their race or ethnicity, black farmers received only 20.8 million of the nearly 26 billion in 2 rounds of payments under the coronavirus food assistance program announced by the Trump administration in April of 2020. Okay. Now, not a single Republican voted for the American Rescue Plan. It was only voted for by Democrats, and Joe Biden signed it into law. There are resources in there to help African-American farmers. This is something that Senator Tim Scott, when he delivered his rebuttal, the GOP rebuttal to Joe Biden's speech to a joint session of Congress, Wednesday, April 28th, 2021. When this is one of the things that Senator Tim Scott was talking about when he said it's backwards to use discriminatory policies to address discrimination. This is one of the things he was talking about, because many Republicans are saying this is racism. They ignore the previous years of history of racism. They ignore that, and they call this racism. So let's continue. How's everybody doing? All right, I want to go back to the article from CNN. So they later received land allotments as part of the 1887 Dawes Allotment Act, which dismantled indigenous reservations and redistributed the land. Some were granted tribal citizenship, but many were not. Now, Elena Roberts' great-great-grandmother was among the thousands of African-American women and men once held in bondage by the Chickasaw Native American tribe, who received land allotments. Her family has now lived in the state of Oklahoma for generations. Now, African Americans began building wealth and founded all black towns. And Oklahoma was probably the state with the most all black towns. If it didn't have the most, it was one of the states with the most all black towns. By late 19th century, Oklahoma attracted people of all races who saw it as an opportunity for a fresh start, land ownership, and prosperity, but soon it became a hotbed for racial tensions. Now, oil is going to be discovered in the early 1900s in Oklahoma, and this is going to cause people of all races to come in, but especially African Americans, because we saw it as a land of opportunity where we could work and acquire land and be independent. Now, Elena Roberts recently spoke with CNN about her book, The Quest for Land and Freedom in the Years Leading to the Tulsa Race Massacre, and how learning about Oklahoma's past changed her views on race. Okay, so they have an excerpt of the interview here. You can check that out. She was asked, it can be hard to talk about this period of history because of how complex it is and because it involves several communities of color. What would you tell people who prefer to avoid this complicated conversation, like many Republicans? Many Republicans don't want to talk about this history and don't want to talk about racism and slavery and things like this. Elena E. Roberts said, it's certainly difficult. It's not the happy narrative that we sometimes want to think about. I think that if we want to come together today and form interracial coalitions, like last year's Black Lives Matter protests, and how people of different races have come together to fight against anti-Asian hatred in a powerful and honest way, we need to acknowledge the past and the issues that we've had there. Well, we need to acknowledge the past regardless, whether you have interracial coalitions or what have you. And even the abolitionist movement, you had a lot of African-American abolitionists, during slavery, but you had white abolitionists also working alongside African-American abolitionists as well. So even if you don't have interracial coalitions, we need to understand this history. America needs a massive history lesson. Americans are very ignorant of history. She was asked a question, in the case of the formerly enslaved African Americans, they had a chance to leave Oklahoma after emancipation. And as you mentioned in the book, blend as African Americans in the United States territories, but many stayed, including your great grandmother. Why? So Elena Roberts said, I argue that it's really the land and the communities that they built within these Indian nations that ends up being more important to them than political rights. So instead of going to the United States and joining this congressional action that is happening right after the Civil War with Republicans, they decided to stay in tribal nations where they don't necessarily have all the rights. For my ancestors in Chickasaw Nation, they don't have rights as citizens at all, but being able to really stay together with their communities and being able to own land is more important to them. Because, see, even when you go back and look at Special Field Order number 15, known as 40 Acres and a Mule, the goal there, that came about, General William T. Sherman had a meeting with African-American leaders, most of them ministers, and in early 1865. And he asked them, he said, look, Civil War is coming to an end. These 4 million enslaved African people are going to be set free. What is it that your people need to be free? What is it that your people need to be independent? They unanimously said land. So the Special Field Order number 15, also known as 40 Acres and a Mule, was an allocation of 400,000 acres of coastal land in South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. It wasn't all the land, and it wasn't land in all the South. It was coastal land in South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. Land to be broken up into or allocated into plots of up to 40 acres. It went to about 40,000 African-American families, something like that, until most of that land was taken back by President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln. And when you read this, and Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. has an article for theroot.com, an extensive article that deals with the history of 40 Acres and a Mule, because a lot of people misunderstand that. It wasn't reparations. People think it was reparations. That wasn't reparations. They weren't saying, because you all work for free, we're going to give you this land. No, they were saying, look, it's inevitable they're going to be set free. Now, what do y'all need to be independent so y'all don't keep coming begging us for stuff? What do you all need? We need land. Okay, we're going to give you land. It wasn't, we're going to give you land because you work for free. Okay? Just so people understand that. It's saying, look, it wasn't because of what you did in the past. It's saying, look, you're going to be set free. Now, what you need in the future to be independent. And then also when you study it, it was also supposed to be like an independent nation where we governed ourselves as well. We'll pull up this article quickly here. The Truth Behind 40 Acres and a Mule. The Truth Behind 40 Acres and a Mule by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. And as I said before, I disagree with him on some things, with the transatlantic slave trade, but I've said he does some good research. I've read dozens of his articles. I've read 2 of his books. So read this article here for more information. The Truth Behind 40 Acres and a Mule. Also, this article is at pbs.org, Public Broadcasting System as well. Because many people totally misunderstand Special Field Order number 15, 40 Acres and a Mule. A lot of people totally misunderstand that. Okay. All right, so read that. Now, when you have these Native American nations owning slaves, this is also how you get a Sarah Rector in Oklahoma. And we've talked about Sarah Rector before. There's a good article from face-to-faceafrica.com about Sarah Rector, who became known as the richest Afro-American girl in the world, and her family was from enslaved Creek ancestry, because her family had been owned by Creek Indians. in Oklahoma. Sarah Rector is like a really, really important piece of history that ties all this history together. We've talked about this before. This is from face-to-faceafrica.com. Meet Sarah Rector, the 12-year-old who became America's youngest black millionaire in 1913. And in this article, it talks about the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties of 1866. You may hear Dr. Claude Anderson talk about this as well. Sarah Rector was born in Indian Territory on March 3rd, 1902. According to sources, he was considered colored, though not African American. Her parents were owned by Creek Indians before the Civil War. As the site The U.S. Slave explains, she and some 600 other black children were entitled to land allotments as the children of enslaved people belonging to the Creek Nation. Okay, why is this? In 1866, the Creek Nation signed a treaty with the United States. In 1866, the Creek Nation signed a treaty with the United States government promising to emancipate their 16,000 slaves and incorporate them into their nation as citizens entitled to, quote, equal interest in the soil and national funds. 2 decades later, the federally imposed Dawes Allotment Act that we just talked about, the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887, sparked the beginning of the total assimilation of the Indians of the so-called 5 civilized tribes by forcing them to live on individually owned lots of land instead of communally, as they had done for centuries. Okay, that ties into the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties of 1866. Okay, so read the rest of this article. Meet Sarah Rector, the 12-year-old who became America's youngest black millionaire in 1913. All right, so this is why it's important to understand a chronology of history, cause and effect. Okay, historical events don't happen in a vacuum. They are the culmination of a sequence of historical events. Okay, they are the culmination of a sequence of historical events that lead to a larger event taking place. If you read the book by Hannibal B. Johnson, I've done an extensive lecture dealing with the history of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you read this book here by Hannibal B. Johnson, Black Wall Street from Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood District. This book, when I was preparing for a lecture I was doing dealing with the history of Black Wall Street, I read this book, and he deals with the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties in here. That ties into the history of Tulsa, Oklahoma. That ties into the history of the Greenwood District in Black Wall Street. All of this history is connected. Okay, all this history is connected. Okay, who we have here? Everybody share this broadcast on your social media platforms. How's everybody doing? Okay. All right. All right, so let's continue here. And let me refresh the screen. I want to make sure we have a good connection. All right, so we're going to continue. I want to continue this discussion. There's a little more information dealing with the Trail of Tears that I want to get to. There was an article from Smithsonian Institute we'll look at briefly. Then there's also some good information from history.com dealing with the Trail of Tears. Okay, we'll look at that here in just a minute. You're watching the African History Network show. If you want to advertise with the African History Network, email us at AHNshow@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AHNshow@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Okay, or you can email us at TheAHNshow@gmail.com. All right, we'll be back in a few minutes.
Gain knowledge in minutes from insightful summaries of progressive and socially conscious books. Blacklisted gives you access to curated content that'll satisfy your curiosity to learn and understand different perspectives. Empower yourself through inspirational and actionable ideas. It's easy to read or listen to on the go. Blacklisted. Empower yourself. Start your free trial today.
We all know the cannabis industry is headed toward an uprise in the past decade. What happens when there is a brand that brings this uprise in a blow? The cannabis industry welcomes her uprise. Hustle her hemp. Delivering excellence with pride is her watchword, and how you choose to embrace it makes it a priority. From cultivating rich cannabis into exquisite and tastefully finished CBD products to delivery, Hustle Her Hemp leaves no stone unturned. Hustle Her Hemp's mission is to empower women of color by building business and creating legacies, uniting beauty, health, and business. We are a pure definition of how we want the CBD industry to become in the future. While we are redefining innovation, we bring the same energy to improving the quality of life. Hustle Her Hemp is the new uprise.
Hi, I'm Joel Wilson, President and CEO of JCW Computer Consulting LLC, a technology implementation firm with over 20 years of satisfying customers. We offer a full spectrum of industry top-tier branded services. We are an authorized partner or reseller for Lenovo, Zoom, T-Mobile, Microsoft 365 and Surface tablets, Google Workspace, Acer, Asus, Samsung, PCmatic security software, and many more. Our online store features laptops, Chromebooks, computers, printers, accessories, and software. Businesses, take advantage of our free 1-hour Zoom tech consultation and know we offer top nationwide high-speed internet service providers, voice over IP, and cellular phone services. Home users, don't miss our current in-stock Chromebook inventory. Please visit us at jcwcc.com or call 215-879-6701.
Welcome back to the African History Network show. Okay. All right, let's continue here. Briefly dealing with the Trail of Tears. So we talked about Sarah Rector. We talked about the article from CNN also. Very quickly here, I want to, there's a good piece from history.com dealing with the Trail of Tears. And this one here is from history.com dealing with the Trail of Tears. And it lays out some history and lays out what happened. And once again, the May 28th is the anniversary of the signing of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which was signed May 28th, 1830. Okay, it was signed May 28th, 1830. So if we look at this article, it talks about how at the beginning of the 1830s, nearly 125,000 Native Americans lived on millions of acres of land in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida, land their ancestors had occupied and cultivated for generations. By the end of the decade, very few natives remained anywhere in the southeastern United States. Working on behalf of white settlers who to grow cotton on the Indians' land, the federal government forced them to leave their homelands and walked hundreds of miles to a specifically designated Indian territory across the Mississippi River. So they were pushed out west of the Mississippi River. This difficult and sometimes deadly journey is known as the Trail of Tears. So it talks about the Indian problem. What is America to do with these Native Americans that many white people in America thought were savage? Okay, they thought they were savage, and killers and heathens and pagans and all types of things like this. Now, white Americans, particularly those who lived on the western frontier, feared and resented the Native Americans they encountered, but yet they stole their land anyway. To them, American Indians seemed to be an unfamiliar alien people. Well, that's how we thought of white people too, but anyway, who occupied land that white settlers wanted and believed they deserved. Now, some officials in the early years of the American Republic, such as President George Washington, believed that the best way to solve this Indian problem was simply to civilize the Native Americans. But in civilizing Native Americans, that meant to teach them to be white. Now, the goal of this civilization campaign was to make Native Americans as much like white Americans as possible by encouraging them to convert to Christianity, learn to speak and read English, and adopt European-style economic practices, such as individual ownership of land and other property, including, in some instances in the South, owning African slaves. Now, the process, this is why history is so important, because it tells you how you got to this point that you're in. The same process that they use to teach Native Americans, the five civilized tribes of Native Americans, teach them how to be white. There's a similar process they used on us, on African Americans. There's a similar process. Not only that, they're going to set up Native American schools for Native American children. And these were boarding schools. And these schools were designed to teach Native American children how to be white. The most famous school is called the Carlisle School. And at these schools, these boarding schools, they were forbidden to speak their Native American languages. Okay, I'm gonna see if there's an article on this that I read. I think it's from history.com. Government boarding schools. Okay. They were forbidden to speak their Native American language. They were forbidden to wear their traditional clothing. They were given white names or English names, white English names, Christian names, things like this. They had to cut their hair. They couldn't wear the traditional Native American hairstyles. This article right here breaks down this history. Government boarding schools once separated Native American children from families. Government boarding schools once separated Native American children from families. Once they returned home, Native American children struggled to relate to their families after being taught that it was wrong to speak their language or practice their religion. So what Europeans were doing was causing a divide between the elders and the parents, causing a divide between them, the previous generation, and the children, and you're infecting the children, teaching them how to be white. This is what's taking place. Okay? So if you look at that tactic that was used to attack Native American children, then you look at negative corporate controlled hip hop, which is used to brainwash and to infect the brain and psyche of African American children and brainwash them. And it's used as a tool of destruction as well. You see a similar process. You see a similar process. This is why you have to understand history. See, a people's history and culture teaches them how to deal with the problems of the past in the present and the future to meet the needs of the community. It also teaches you how to defend yourself against these attacks, because this stuff repeats itself. It may not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. It may not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. So if you understand history, you can change the trajectory of the future. But you have to understand how to perceive these attacks coming towards you. If you understand history, you can see these attacks coming. This is why in 2016, months before the presidential election, I was warning our people about Donald Trump. I saw the attacks that were coming because I understood Richard Nixon and I understood George Wallace. And everything I said turned out to be true. Okay. So read this article here. In 1879, okay, the Carlisle School is the most famous Native American school, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. How many people have never heard of this information before? The Carlisle Indian Industrial School was a government-backed institution that forcibly separated Native American children from their parents in order to kill the Indian in him and save the man. In 1879, U.S. Cavalry Captain Richard Henry Pratt opened a boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But it was not the kind of boarding school in which that rich parents send their children to. Rather, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was a government-backed institution that forcibly separated Native American children from their parents in order to, as Richard Henry Pratt put it, kill the Indian in him and save the man. Over the next several decades, Carlisle served as a model for nearly 150 such schools that were set up to teach Native American children how to be white. There was approximately 150 schools like this in America. They opened around the country. Like the 1887, there it is again, the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, foreign resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. This is why you have to understand history and policies and laws are intersected. They intersect. They're combined. Okay? Like the 1887 Dawes Allotment Act that reallocated Native American land, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs 1902 haircut order specifying that men with long hair could not receive rations. Native American boarding schools were a method of forced assimilation. The end goal of these measures was to make Native people more like white Anglo-Americans who had taken over their land. Well, they used some of these same tactics on African Americans. This is why many of us still have our slave masters' names, or former slave masters' names. At boarding schools, staff forced indigenous students to cut their hair and use Anglo-American names because they're teaching them to see reality through the eyes of Europeans. So they're forcing European culture on them and stripping them of Native American culture, turning them against their parents and their grandparents and their ancestors. They forbid the children from speaking their native language and observing their religious and cultural practices. Does that sound familiar? And by removing them from their homes, the schools disrupted students' relationships with their families. And by removing them from their homes, the school disrupted students' relationships with their families and other members of the Native American tribe. Once they returned home, children struggled to relate to their families after being taught that it was wrong to speak their language or practice their religion. So this shows children of an Apache tribe before and during their time at the Carlisle Industrial School. They were taught to be white. Many of us have been taught to be white. But we don't understand it. See, your history and culture acts as an immune system. that protects you from attackers coming in and attacking you. It acts as an immune system. When you strip away that immune system, you become sick, you become infected. So read this full article here. I don't have time to get into it. I only have so much energy and so much time. Read the rest of this article. We'll continue now. I want to go back to, because all this history is tied together. We have to understand the tactics that would have been used in the past to attack us, so we understand how to defend ourselves against these tactics. Because they're taking place today. But if you don't understand the history behind what it is that you're seeing, you may think it's something beneficial. And when they talked about the economic system, see, we come from we came from a system of cooperative economics, the co-ops, the cooperatives, right? Where like the Colored Farmers Union, 1886, and you read Dr. Jessica Gordon Nimhard book, read her book, Collective Courage, which deals with the history of cooperative economics among African Americans. Well, many of us went to white business schools and learned white business principles and learned capitalism, individual capitalism. And then we brought white business principles back to the African American community, where historically we had a history, like the Colored Merchants Association, founded in about 1928, coming out of the Negro Business League, which was created by Booker T. Washington. You had all these cooperatives where we collectively we were members in these organizations, collectively own these organizations, many times collectively own businesses, but we pooled resources together. This is how we made it. But then when we went to white business schools and learned white business principles and learned about individual capitalism, and then brought these white business principles back to the African American community and implement them, they may work for your family, but they don't work in general for the collective. And then when you break up the cooperatives, you help to break up the cooperation. When you break up the cooperatives, you help to break up the cooperation, because for the cooperatives to work, you have to cooperate. All right. So let me see something here. Okay. So let's go back to this one here, dealing with the Trail of Tears from History.com. Trail of Tears. Now, this is some of the type of information also that we deal with in the online course that I teach, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, where they didn't teach in school. But we deal with thousands of years of history. In this, it's a 9-week, 18-hour, it's a 9-week online course that I teach Saturdays, 12 noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll post the link again so you can register for the class. So next class is Saturday, May 15th. Okay, so the goal of this civilization campaign to civilize Native Americans was to make Native Americans as much like white Americans as possible by encouraging them to convert to Christianity, learn to speak English, learn to speak and read English, and adopt European style economic practices, such as the individual ownership of land and other property. Other property included owning slaves in the South. Now, in the southeastern United States, many Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, Creek, and Cherokee people embraced these customs, these white customs, and became known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans. The 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans. Okay. But their land, located in parts of Georgia, Alabama, California, Florida, and Tennessee, was valuable, and it grew to be more coveted as white settlers flooded the region. Many of these white people yearned to make their fortunes by growing cotton, and they did not care how civilized their native neighbors were. They wanted that land, and they would do almost anything to get it, including killing them for it. They stole lives. They burned and looted houses and towns, committed mass murder among Native Americans, and squatted on land that did not belong to them. This was white people doing this. This is Europeans here in this country doing this to Native Americans. And some Native Americans were African people also, because we intermixed into these populations. And see, going back to the first Americans were Africans, documented evidence by Dr. David Imhotep. And I'll probably have them teach another session of the class. I'll probably have them speak to my class as well this time around. When you just so you know, when you register for the online course, you get to you will have access to the class I taught in February and March. And he was one of the guest speakers in the class when I taught in February and March. So you'll be able to watch that. It's exclusive content. Okay. You'll be able to watch that. Also, Sister Nubia Wardford, who's a cultural anthropologist, she spoke to my class as well. You'll be able to watch that also. We dealt with the African queens at antiquity in ancient Africa. So when you deal with African people who were here when Europeans came to this land, European settlers came here, some of these groups of African people get reclassified as Native Americans also. That's the other thing. Okay. That's the other part of history that gets left out. This is why 1619, even though 1619 is an important year, I mean, it's like we were here for thousands of years before 1619. This is one of the problems with the 1619 project. It does not deal with the history of African people in this land going back thousands of years. Okay, now this is the book I was looking for by Dr. Jessica Gordon Nemhard, Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. This deals with our deep, rich history of the co-ops and how we economically empowered ourselves. Everything from the Free African Society to the Colored Merchants Association. We have a deep, rich history of economic development through the co-ops, the cooperatives. All right, let's see here. Okay, so then they talk about Andrew Jackson, all this. Read the rest of this, okay? I don't have time to get through all this. You have Donald Trump's favorite president, white supremacist Andrew Jackson. Read this article from history.com, Trail of Tears, okay? And let me see, any removal, Andrew, okay. Let me get to the highlights because I have some notations here that Indian problem. Okay, Indian problem, stole livestock, where southern states were determined to take ownership of Indian lands who would go, okay. Indian removal, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had long been an advocate for Indian removal as an Army general. He had spent years leading brutal campaigns against the Creek Indians in Georgia and Alabama and the Seminoles in Florida. We know a lot of Seminoles were Africans and rental slaves, things like this. The Seminoles in Florida, campaigns that resulted in the transfer of hundreds of thousands of acres of land from Indian nations to white farmers. So Florida was Spanish territory up until about 1821. And one of the reasons why the U.S. wanted that land in Florida is because a lot of African slaves were running into Florida, living with Native Americans. Okay, because Florida was free territory. It was Spanish territory. And it's free territory up until about 1821, when right around 1821, the U.S. takes over that territory. Okay. All right. This is a deep history. This is why you have to understand the chronology of history. Now, as president, Andrew Jackson continued this crusade against Native Americans. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act. It was May 28th, 1830. He signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the federal government the power to exchange native-held land in the Cotton Kingdom east of the Mississippi River for land to the west of the Mississippi River in the Indian colonization zone, that the United States had acquired as part of what? The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And that in Louisiana Purchase came about because the Haitians beat the hell out the French. Okay, during the Haitian Revolution. This Indian territory was located in present-day Oklahoma. This is why you have to understand the chronology of history. It's one of my teachers, Akaba Hiawatha Kamene, says historical events. He says to understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. To understand the existence of something, you must first understand the pre-existence of existence. Now, the law required the government to negotiate removal treaties fairly, voluntarily, and peacefully, but we know they don't do that. It did not permit the president or anyone else to coerce native nations into giving up their land. However, white supremacist President Andrew Jackson and his government frequently ignored the letter of the law and forced Native Americans to vacate lands they had lived on for generations. In the winter of 1831, under threat of invasion by the U.S. Army, the Choctaw became the first nation to be expelled from its land altogether. They made the journey to Indian territory on foot, some bound in chains, and marched double file, one historian writes, and without food, supplies, or help from the U.S. government. Thousands of people died along the way. It was one Choctaw leader. One Choctaw leader told an Alabama newspaper, it was a trail of tears and death. A trail of tears and death. The Indian removal process continued. In 1836, the federal government drove Creek Indians from their land for the last time. 3,500 of the 15,000 Creeks who set out for Oklahoma did not survive the trip. And it's going to be right around 1836. When the Creek go into Oklahoma, they're going to found an area they call Tallahassee. Tallahassee became Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa is from a Creek Indian word, Tallahassee. Read the rest of this. Okay, I don't have time to get through all this. Trail of Tears from history.com. History.com is the official website of the History Channel. Okay. Now, lastly, there was an article, and then we'll get to Tim Tebow in just a second. We'll talk about that for a few minutes. There was a piece from a big article from SmithsonianMag.com that I was looking at and I referenced a couple of days ago. Now, this also ties into Lewis Cass. Now, Lewis Cass is the white man who Cass Technical High School is named after. Famous Cass Technical High School here in Detroit, my alma mater. And Lewis Cass was a slave owner. Now, from reports, he owned one slave. But I posted this article a couple of days ago, and there was a building renamed, a state building renamed. It was named after Lewis Cass, and it was renamed. Let me see if I can pull this up. But it deals with the history of Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass was the Secretary of State under President Andrew Jackson's administration. And Lewis Cass helped to carry out the Indian Removal Act that not only pushed Native Americans off their land, that pushed African people off their land also, because some of the people who were on the Trail of Tears were African people because they were owned by these Native American nations. Okay. So let's see here. What's the name of that article? Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears. Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears. This is a big article from the SmithsonianMag.com from the Smithsonian Institute. Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears, okay? America's Forgotten Migration. Now, I want people to understand. People who understand their history and respect themselves don't name their institutions after their oppressors. They don't name their institutions after the oppressors that helped carry out genocide against their own people. They don't name their institutions after people who helped kill their ancestors. They name their institutions after people who helped to liberate them, not keep them oppressed. This is why Cass Technical High School, the name needs to be changed. Why the hell would you have a school named after a white supremacist like Lewis Cass? That makes no sense. But some of us gain prestige and gain self-esteem from closer proximity to white supremacy. Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears. Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears. This is from SmithsonianMag.com, Smithsonian Institute, their website, their magazine. America's Forgotten Migration. The journey of 1 million African Americans from the tobacco South to the cotton South. Okay, and it talks about the forced migration of African Americans, African people, African slaves as well. This one here. I don't have time to get deep into this. We may do a separate. We may do something separate on this, but check out this article. This is, I think maybe about 15, 20 pages, something like that, this article. Let me go to, very quickly here. Let me go to page 5. Just a second. Okay. Slave Trail of Tears. The Slave Trail of Tears is the great, where is that? The Slave Trail of Tears is the great missing migration, 1,000-mile long river of people, all of them Black or African, reaching from Virginia. During the 50 years before the Civil War starts in 1861, about 1 million enslaved people moved from Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, to Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. They were made to go, deported, you could say, having been sold. This forced resettlement was 20 times larger than Andrew Jackson's Indian removal campaigns of the 1830s, even though there were Africans then also on the Trail of Tears, that one in the 1830s. About a third of those people with the Native Americans, about a third of them, somewhere around that, were African slaves. And now I've heard some people say some of them were servants or whatever. Okay. All right. That makes you feel better and sleep better at night. This forced resettlement was 20 times larger than Andrew Jackson's Indian removal campaigns of the 1830s, which gave rise to the original Trail of Tears as it drove tribes of Native Americans out of Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. It was bigger than the immigration of Jews into the United States during the 19th century, when some 500,000 arrived from Russia and Eastern Europe. Okay? It was bigger than the wagon train migration to the West, beloved of American lore. This movement lasted longer and grabbed up more people than any other migration in North America before 1900. Okay, this is about a million, because you know the Great Migration of 1915 to 1970, you have between 6 to 7 million African Americans migrating out of the South, up north, and out west. The drama of 1 million individuals going so far from their homes changed the country, changed the United States. It gave the Deep South a character it retains to this day, and it changed the slaves themselves, traumatizing uncountable families. But until recently, the slave trail was buried in memory. The story of the masses who trekked 1,000 miles from the tobacco South to the cotton South sometimes vanished in an economic tale. One about the invention of the cotton gin, which is around 1793, and the rise of King Cotton. It sometimes sank into a political story, something to do with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and the first Southwest, the young states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Historians know about the slave trail. During the last 10 years, a number of them, Edward Baptist, he's a Facebook friend of mine, Edward Baptist, historian Edward Baptist, Stephen Dale, Robert Mestad, Walter Johnson, Joshua Rothman, Calvin Schermerhorn, Michael Tadman, and others have been writing the million-person migration back into view. Okay, so read this. This is a long article here. This is from Smithsonian Mag. Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears. Retracing Slavery's Trail of Tears. This happens after this happens after the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. And this is a Trail of Tears of 1 million. This is a journey of 1 million African Americans from the tobacco South to the cotton South. All right. Okay, so check that out. We'll post this link here. And then register for the online course that I teach ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Next class is Saturday, May 15th, 12 noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We do the classes live. All the sessions are recorded. So if you miss anything, you have to work, what have you, you can go back and watch it. Okay, that's not a problem. You can go back and watch it. And as soon as you register, you can watch the class that we did last Saturday. Okay, as soon as you register. Let me post the link here again. So it's a 9-week online course that I teach. We do thousands of years of history. Even after the course is over with, you'll still have access to view the course also. All right, look, we have to get out of here. Remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering. Oh, and I have my Muhammad Ali shirt on, in case people were wondering. My Muhammad Ali shirt. All right, remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world. Because right now, it's correct wrong behavior is not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Peace.
For 25 years, the Black History 101 Mobile Museum has carried on the rich legacy of the Black Museum movement in America by showcasing original artifacts of the Black experience at colleges, universities, K-12 schools, corporations, libraries, conferences, and cultural events, making it the most traversed Black History mobile exhibit in American history. Dr. Khalid El Hakim is the founder of the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, and he is a highly sought-after public speaker on topics of Black history, social studies, education, museum studies, hip-hop, and race relations. Dr. Khalid was named among the change makers for NBC Universal's Erase the Hate campaign and listed as one of the 100 men of distinction for Black enterprise. He recently founded the Michigan Hip Hop Archive on the campus of Western Michigan University. The Black History 101 Mobile Museum is currently scheduling in-person and virtual exhibits nationwide. For more information, please contact Dr. Khalid Al-Hakim directly at 313-645-4197, 313-645-4197, or visit their website at blackhistorymobilemuseum.com. That's blackhistorymobilemuseum.com. You can also email him at bhistory101@yahoo.com, bhistory101@yahoo.com.
Digital Dandelion's Technical Solutions works with businesses like yours to create an operations manual for your business, which is something many businesses don't have. According to AARP, more than 30% of small business owners are over 50 years old. Many business owners want to retire by selling their businesses or by passing their businesses on to their children. However, according to Forbes Investment Advisors, many retiring owners' attempts to sell their businesses for retirement fail. You cannot sell your business without a business manual. Your children also cannot inherit your business because there is no way to run it. Your business does not have to die when you leave. Their business Bible products will give you the tools you need for a thriving business that can make you money even after you retire. Are you looking at increasing your business's annual revenue? Digital Dandelions can help you make at least $100,000 in annual revenue and expand your business. Speak with them today about solidifying your business. Visit digitaldandelions.com today and get a free 30-minute consultation.
We all know the cannabis industry is headed toward an uprise in the past decade. What happens when there is a brand that brings this uprise in a blow? The cannabis industry welcomes her uprise. Hustle her hemp. Delivering excellence with pride is her watchword, and how you choose to embrace it makes it a priority. From cultivating rich cannabis into exquisite and tastefully finished CBD products to delivery, Hustle Her Hemp leaves no stone unturned. Hustle Her Hemp's mission is to empower women of color by building business and creating legacies, uniting beauty, health, and business. We are a pure definition of how we want the CBD industry to become in the future. While we are redefining innovation, we bring the same energy to improving the quality of life. Hustle Her Hemp is the new uprise.
Hi, I'm Joel Wilson, President and CEO of JCW Computer Consulting LLC, a technology implementation firm with over 20 years of satisfying customers. We offer a full spectrum of industry top-tier branded services. We are an authorized partner or reseller for Lenovo, Zoom, T-Mobile, Microsoft 365 and Surface tablets, Google Workspace, Acer, Asus, Samsung, PCmatic security software, and many more. Our online store features laptops, Chromebooks, computers, printers, accessories, and software. Businesses, take advantage of our free